My name is Marissa Grant, and I'm 42 years old. For 11 years, I worked as a compliance analyst at Alder and Slate Consulting, a mid-tier financial services firm in Minneapolis. I believed in following the rules, doing my job well, and keeping my head down. 2 years ago, I went through a messy divorce that left me with nothing but debt and a tabby cat named Whiskey. I thought I had learned to accept my place in the world, to be grateful for what little stability I had left. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The mug that changed everything wasn't particularly special. White ceramic with black lettering that read, "World's Best Enemy." I bought it for myself after the divorce papers were signed. A bitter little joke about how the world seemed determined to kick me when I was down. Every morning, I'd fill it with coffee and sit at my gray cubicle, sipping while I reviewed compliance reports and budget analyses. It was my small act of rebellion in a place that demanded complete conformity. The trouble started when they hired Brenda Holloway as our new department head. She arrived with the kind of polished confidence that screamed TED Talk presenter. All bright smiles and buzzwords about transforming workplace culture and creating safe spaces for authentic communication. She had short blonde hair styled in an expensive cut, wore blazers that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and spoke in the measured tones of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Within her first week, Brenda sent out a company-wide email about fostering positivity and eliminating toxic elements from our shared environment. I remember reading it while drinking from my mug and thinking it was just another corporate initiative that would fade away like all the others. I had survived budget cuts, reorganizations, and 3 different management changes. I figured I could survive Brenda Holloway too. The first sign of trouble came during a team meeting about quarterly projections. I was presenting budget variance reports when Brenda interrupted me mid-sentence. "Marissa, I couldn't help but notice your coffee mug," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone managers use when they're about to deliver bad news wrapped in concern. "I'm wondering if you've considered how messaging like that might affect team morale." I looked down at my mug, sitting innocuously on the conference table next to my laptop. "I'm sorry, what messaging?" "World's best enemy," she read aloud, as if the words themselves were toxic. "It's quite negative, don't you think? Almost hostile." The room fell silent. My colleagues suddenly found their notepads fascinating. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my voice steady. "It's just a coffee mug, Brenda, a personal joke." "I understand that," she said, maintaining that professional smile. "But we're trying to build a culture of mutual support here. Little things like this can really undermine that effort." I wanted to argue, to point out that my personal coffee mug had nothing to do with my work performance or my interactions with colleagues. Instead, I nodded and said nothing. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was thinking the mug incident would blow over. Instead, it became the opening salvo in what I can only describe as a campaign of psychological warfare. Brenda began scheduling check-ins with me every few days, ostensibly to discuss my workload and well-being. These sessions felt more like interrogations, with her asking probing questions about my attitude, my relationships with coworkers, and my alignment with company values. She started copying HR on emails about minor issues, creating a paper trail that made me look difficult and uncooperative. When I submitted reports that questioned budget discrepancies, she would send them back with notes about maintaining a collaborative tone and considering multiple perspectives. When I ate lunch alone, she would make pointed comments about team building and being part of the family. The family metaphor was particularly galling. I had worked at Alder and Slate for over a decade, had trained new employees, had stayed late countless nights to meet deadlines. But suddenly, because I owned a sarcastic coffee mug, I was the problem child who needed constant supervision. 3 weeks into Brenda's tenure, I received an email that made my blood run cold. The subject line read, "Mandatory Workplace Sensitivity Training, Individual Session Required." The message was brief and formal, informing me that I had been selected for additional cultural competency education due to recent behavioral concerns. I stared at the screen, reading the email 3 times before the full implications sank in. I was being singled out for sensitivity training because of a coffee mug. Not because I had harassed anyone, not because I had violated any actual policies, but because Brenda Holloway had decided that my personal property was somehow threatening to workplace harmony. The training session was scheduled for the following Monday in a small conference room that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. The facilitator was a nervous young woman named Janet, who kept apologizing for the unfortunate necessity of the meeting while working through a PowerPoint presentation about microaggressions and implicit bias. Sometimes we don't realize how our words and actions affect others, Janet explained, clicking through slides filled with stock photos of diverse professionals shaking hands. Even something as simple as a coffee mug can send unintended messages about our values and intentions. I sat through the 2-hour session in silence, occasionally nodding when Janet looked at me expectantly. When she asked if I had any questions, I shook my head. When she asked me to sign a form acknowledging that I had completed the training, I signed it without reading the fine print. That was my third mistake. The form I signed wasn't just an acknowledgement of training completion, it was a behavioral agreement that committed me to maintaining a positive and supportive attitude in all workplace interactions, and avoiding any displays of negativity or hostility that might impact team morale. The language was vague enough to give management broad discretion in interpreting my future behavior. I discovered this when I received another email 2 days later. This one from Margot Beckett in Human Resources. Margot was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, the kind of person who wore her efficiency like armor. Her email was characteristically blunt. Please see me in my office at 2 p.m. today to discuss your continued employment with Alder and Slate. The meeting was brief and brutal. Margot sat behind her desk with a manila folder open in front of her, scanning documents with the detached professionalism of someone who had conducted hundreds of these conversations. Marissa, I'm going to be direct with you, she began. Your recent behavior has become a concern for management. The incident with the coffee mug, your resistance to cultural sensitivity training, and your general attitude toward new leadership initiatives have created a hostile work environment. I felt like I was drowning in corporate doublespeak. Margot, I've never been hostile to anyone. I've done my job well for 11 years. This is about a coffee mug. It's about a pattern of behavior that suggests you're not aligned with our company values, she replied, her voice flat and mechanical. We're prepared to offer you a choice. You can voluntarily resign with 2 weeks severance pay, or we can pursue formal disciplinary action that may result in termination for cause. The room spun slightly. I gripped the armrests of my chair, trying to process what I was hearing. They were threatening to fire me for cause over a coffee mug. Not poor performance, not misconduct, not any actual violation of company policy. A coffee mug. I need time to think about this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You have until Friday, Margot said, closing the folder. We'll need your decision by end of business. I walked back to my cubicle in a daze, my colleagues' eyes following me like I was carrying some contagious disease. I sat down at my desk and stared at the mug that had started this whole nightmare. The black letters seemed to mock me now. World's best enemy. Maybe I was. That evening, I sat in my apartment with whiskey purring on my lap, trying to figure out how my life had imploded so quickly. The cat seemed to sense my distress, pressing his warm body against my chest while I struggled not to cry. I had nowhere to go, no family to fall back on, no savings to cushion the blow of unemployment. The divorce had taken care of that. But as I sat there in the dark, something began to nag at me. A memory from several months ago, before Brenda's arrival. When I had been reviewing quarterly budget reports, there had been a discrepancy in one of the client accounts, a substantial amount that didn't match the services rendered. I had flagged it in my report and sent it to the previous department head, who had promised to look into it. The investigation had apparently stalled when he left the company, and I had assumed the new leadership would pick up where he left off. But now I wondered if that discrepancy had been quietly buried, filed away and forgotten in the chaos of transition. I spent the night going through my old emails, searching for any reference to the budget irregularity. I found it buried in a folder labeled Pending Issues. a chain of correspondence about $127,000 in consulting fees that couldn't be accounted for. The trail ended abruptly when my former supervisor announced his departure. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting Margot's ultimatum, I printed out every email, every report, every document related to that budget discrepancy. I stuffed them into a manila envelope and drove to the public library, where I spent the morning researching whistleblower protection laws and employment attorneys. Most of the lawyers I found online were either too expensive or too busy to take on a wrongful termination case. But one small firm, tucked between a pawn shop and a used car lot, offered free consultations. The lawyer, a young man named Derek McAllister, looked like he had just graduated from law school. His office was cramped and cluttered, with law books stacked on folding tables and a coffee maker that looked older than I was. "So they're firing you over a coffee mug?" Derek asked, leaning back in his chair with a skeptical expression. "That's either the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week, or there's something else going on here." I spread the budget documents across his desk, explaining the discrepancy I had discovered and my suspicion that it might be connected to my sudden fall from grace. Derek's expression grew more serious as he examined the paperwork. "This is interesting," he said, pointing to a line item that showed consulting fees paid to a company I'd never heard of. "Have you tried to verify whether this vendor actually exists?" I hadn't. But Derek pulled out his laptop and began searching. After a few minutes, he looked up with raised eyebrows. "Pinnacle Strategic Solutions doesn't exist," he said. "No business registration, no website, no phone number. This looks like a shell company." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Someone at Alder and Slate had been siphoning money through fake consulting contracts, and I had stumbled onto their scheme. The coffee mug controversy wasn't about workplace culture. It was about getting rid of someone who had asked too many questions. "I need to dig deeper into this," Derek said, gathering up the documents. "But Marissa, if what we're looking at is fraud, this case just got a lot more complicated and a lot more dangerous." I left Derek's office with a mixture of fear and determination. I had 48 hours to give Margot my answer, but I already knew what I was going to do. I wasn't going to resign quietly and disappear into the night. I was going to fight. The next 2 days were a blur of secret meetings and covert document gathering. Derek had connected me with a forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Together, we began piecing together a pattern of financial irregularities that stretched back over 2 years. The fake consulting payments were just the beginning. There were inflated vendor invoices, duplicate billing for services never rendered, and budget transfers that made no sense. The total amount was staggering, over $720,000 in fraudulent transactions, all carefully hidden within the normal operations of a mid-sized consulting firm. And at the center of it all was Brenda Halloway, who had arrived at Alder and Slate with impeccable credentials and a mandate to streamline operations. Her method of streamlining, it appeared, involved creating a complex web of phantom expenses and disappeared funds. On Friday morning, I walked into Margot's office with a different kind of manila folder. This one contained copies of fraudulent invoices, bank records, and a detailed timeline of financial irregularities. I also brought my lawyer. "I won't be resigning," I announced, setting the folder on Margot's desk. "Instead, I'll be filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's Office for Financial Fraud and a lawsuit for wrongful termination and retaliation." Margot's composed facade cracked slightly as she opened the folder and began scanning the documents. Her face grew pale as she realized what she was looking at. "These are serious accusations," she said carefully. "I'll need to review this with legal counsel." "Take your time," Derek interjected. "We'll be filing the complaint on Monday regardless, but we thought you might want a chance to respond before this becomes public." The meeting ended with Margot promising to get back to us soon, which in corporate speak meant they were panicking behind closed doors. I returned to my cubicle for what I suspected would be the last time, packed my personal belongings into a cardboard box, and took my coffee mug home. That weekend, I waited. Derek had warned me that the company would likely try to discredit me, to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. He was right. By Monday morning, I had received a certified letter informing me that I was being terminated for gross misconduct and violation of company policies. The letter cited my hostile behavior and refusal to participate in cultural improvement initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were firing me for the very behavior that had led me to discover their fraud, but their counterattack backfired spectacularly. The termination letter, with its vague accusations and obvious retaliation, only strengthened our case. Derek filed a comprehensive lawsuit that included wrongful termination, whistleblower retaliation, and fraud claims. We also submitted a detailed complaint to the State Attorney General's office and the Securities and Exchange Commission. The local business newspaper picked up the story within a week. The headline read, "Local consulting firm faces fraud allegations after firing whistleblower." The article included a photograph of me holding my coffee mug, which had somehow become a symbol of resistance against corporate corruption. Alder and Slate's response was swift and predictable. They hired a high-powered law firm and began a campaign to discredit me personally and professionally. Private investigators showed up at my apartment building, asking neighbors about my mental state and drinking habits. Former colleagues received calls asking about my work performance and attitude. But the financial evidence was overwhelming. The forensic accountant had traced the fraudulent payments to a series of shell companies, all of which led back to accounts controlled by Brenda Holloway and two other executives. The scheme had been sophisticated and well concealed, but once we knew what to look for, the pattern was unmistakable. The investigation took months. I survived on unemployment benefits and the occasional freelance accounting job, always looking over my shoulder for the next attempt at intimidation. My phone rang at odd hours with hang-up calls. My car was vandalized twice. Someone broke into my apartment while I was at the grocery store, though nothing was stolen. Through it all, I kept that coffee mug on my kitchen counter, a daily reminder of how a simple act of corporate pettiness had exposed something much darker. Whiskey seemed to understand that we were under siege, staying close to me and hissing at strangers who approached our door. The breakthrough came when the FBI raided Alder and Slate's offices on a Thursday morning in March. I learned about it from a text message from Derek, who had been monitoring the investigation through his contacts at the Attorney General's office. The raid yielded boxes of documents and several computer hard drives, providing federal investigators with the physical evidence they needed to build criminal cases. Brenda Holloway was arrested at her home the following week. The news footage showed her being led away in handcuffs, her professional composure finally cracking as reporters shouted questions about the missing money. Two other executives were arrested the same day, including the CFO who had signed off on the fraudulent payments. The criminal charges changed everything. Suddenly, Alder and Slate was facing not just civil lawsuits, but federal prosecution. The company's stock price plummeted, clients began canceling contracts, and the board of directors went into crisis mode. Derek called me on a Friday afternoon in April with news that would change my life. "They want to settle," he said, his voice barely containing his excitement. "The company, not the individuals. They're offering a substantial sum to resolve the wrongful termination and retaliation claims." The settlement negotiations took place in a conference room high above downtown Minneapolis, with views of the Mississippi River and the city I had called home for most of my adult life. On one side of the table sat Alder and Slate's legal team, 5 lawyers in expensive suits who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. On the other side, Derek and I faced them across a polished oak table that probably cost more than my annual salary. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Webb, opened with what he clearly thought was a generous offer. "My client is prepared to offer Ms. Source grant 6 months' salary plus benefits continuation in exchange for a complete release of all claims." Derek laughed. Actually laughed. "Mr. Webb, I think you misunderstand the situation. Your client fired my client for exposing $720,000 in fraud. This isn't about severance pay. This is about compensation for retaliation against a whistleblower." The negotiations continued for hours, with Webb's team gradually increasing their offer as Derek methodically dismantled their arguments. The company wanted confidentiality, but Derek insisted on my right to discuss the case publicly. They wanted a broad release that would prevent future claims, but Derek limited it to the specific issues at hand. By the end of the day, we had reached an agreement that exceeded my wildest expectations. The settlement amount was substantial enough to provide financial security for years to come. But more importantly, it included an admission that I had been wrongfully terminated and retaliated against for reporting potential fraud. The signing ceremony was surreal. I sat at that expensive conference table with a fountain pen in my hand, about to sign a document that would end my association with Alder and Slate forever. As I wrote my name, I thought about all the mornings I had spent in that gray cubicle, drinking coffee from my sarcastic mug and believing that keeping quiet was the safest path. I had been wrong about that, spectacularly wrong. Sometimes the safest path is the one that leads directly through danger. The criminal trials began 6 months later. I testified as a key witness in the prosecution of Brenda Holloway and her co-conspirators, describing how my discovery of the budget discrepancies had led to my harassment and eventual termination. The defense attorneys tried to portray me as a vindictive employee seeking revenge, but the financial evidence was overwhelming. Brenda was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. She received a 5-year prison sentence and was ordered to pay restitution to the company and its clients. The other executives received similar sentences, though one managed to negotiate a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his co-conspirators. Alder and Slate never recovered from the scandal. The company filed for bankruptcy protection within a year. Unable to survive the loss of clients and the massive legal costs, the building where I had worked for 11 years was sold to a real estate developer who converted it into luxury condominiums. I never returned to the corporate world. The settlement money allowed me to start my own forensic accounting practice, specializing in fraud detection and whistleblower protection. My first client was a small nonprofit that suspected their bookkeeper of embezzlement. My second was a manufacturing company whose CFO had been systematically inflating expenses to hide kickbacks from suppliers. It turned out that my experience at Alder and Slate had taught me something valuable about recognizing the signs of corporate fraud. The same instincts that had led me to question those budget discrepancies served me well in my new career. I developed a reputation for being thorough, relentless, and completely unbribable. The coffee mug sits on my home office desk now, filled with pens and paper clips rather than coffee. I've upgraded to a proper espresso machine, a luxury I never could have afforded on my old salary. But I keep the mug as a reminder of how quickly things can change, how a simple act of defiance can ripple outward in ways you never expect. Whiskey approves of my new schedule, I think. He spends his days stretched across my desk, purring contentedly while I review financial statements and prepare reports. He's getting old now, his tabby coat graying around the edges, but he still has the energy to hiss at suspicious visitors. People sometimes ask me if I regret not taking that severance package, if I wish I had just walked away quietly and found another job. The answer is always no. I regret many things about my time at Alder and Slate, the years I spent keeping my head down, the opportunities I missed to speak up, the way I let fear dictate my choices. But I don't regret fighting back. The truth is, I never set out to expose corporate fraud or become a whistleblower. I just wanted to drink my coffee in peace and do my job without being harassed about my personal property. But sometimes the universe has other plans, and sometimes standing up for something small leads to something much bigger. Derek still handles my legal work, though his practice has grown considerably since our victory against Alder and Slate. He moved to a better office, one with actual windows and furniture that wasn't purchased at a yard sale. He still drinks terrible coffee, though, and he still takes on cases that bigger firms won't touch. The other day, he called me about a new client, a woman who had been fired from a marketing firm for refusing to participate in mandatory team-building exercises that she felt were inappropriate. The company claimed she was culturally incompatible with their values. Derek thought I might be able to help with the financial analysis of her case. "Let me guess," I said. They're trying to get rid of her for reasons that have nothing to do with her job performance. That's what I'm thinking, Derek replied. But I need someone who understands how these corporate games work, someone who can spot the patterns. I agreed to take the case. As I hung up the phone, I looked at my old coffee mug and smiled. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay quiet when powerful people want you to disappear. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what they least expect. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I learned it well. And now, when other people find themselves in similar situations, I'm there to help them fight back. Because the truth is, corporate bullies rely on silence and fear to maintain their power. When you refuse to be silent, when you refuse to be afraid, you rob them of their greatest weapon. The mug that started it all sits on my desk now. No longer a symbol of bitter resignation, but a reminder of what's possible when you decide to stand up for yourself. World's best enemy. It's funny how accurate that turned out to be. I became their worst enemy, not through malice or revenge, but simply by refusing to let them win. In the end, that was enough. That was more than enough.